Ryan Cole laughed first. He pointed at the patch on her uniform, 2 words Combat Master, and he laughed loud enough for the entire briefing room to hear. You. He said it like a joke, like the answer was already obvious. Natalie Brooks didn't flinch. She didn't explain herself. She just looked at him with the kind of calm that only comes from someone who has already survived the worst thing you can imagine. If this story already has your attention, subscribe to our channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The briefing room at Fort Blackridge Advanced Warfare Center had a particular kind of silence before it filled up. Not a peaceful silence, a competitive one. The kind that existed between people who spent their entire careers measuring themselves against each other, calculating rank and reputation the way civilians calculated salaries. Everyone who walked through that door carried a record. Everyone had deployments, commendations, performance reviews, combat citations filed in folders that other soldiers whispered about in hallways. And everyone without exception believed they understood exactly what a real warrior looked like. Master Sergeant Ryan Cole arrived 7 minutes early. He always arrived early. Not because he was anxious, because arriving first was its own kind of statement. It said he owned the room before anyone else walked into it. He set his coffee on the table, pulled out the chair at the front left position, the one with the clearest line of sight to the screen and the door simultaneously, and he sat down the way a man sits when he knows everyone else is about to walk into his territory. 20 years. That was the number that defined Ryan Cole. 20 years of special operations. 4 combat zones. 2 classified missions that he couldn't discuss publicly and wouldn't discuss privately. He had trained under commanders who had trained under legends. He had run operations in environments most soldiers never experienced and survived contact that most soldiers never survived. He was not arrogant in the casual way of someone who had never been tested. He was arrogant in the specific, precise way of someone who had been tested repeatedly and had never been broken. And that distinction he believed mattered. The room filled quickly. Instructors, combat veterans, team leaders with deployment patches stacked on their sleeves. These were not recruits. These were not students in the traditional sense. They were evaluators, operators, men and women who had spent enough time in active operations that training exercises felt like translations useful, but always slightly different from the real language. Ryan watched each person enter the way he always watched. Assessing, calculating, organizing the room into tiers of competence before a single word was spoken. It was a habit so ingrained he no longer noticed he was doing it. He had simply learned across 2 decades that reading a room correctly before the briefing started meant understanding the actual power structure rather than the one that existed on paper. He recognized most of the faces, nodded at 2 instructors he'd trained with the previous year, exchanged a brief wordless acknowledgement with Colonel Whitman, the base commander, who would be running the evaluation. Everything felt familiar, expected, controlled. Then Staff Sergeant Natalie Brooks walked in. Ryan almost didn't register her at first, not because she was forgettable, because she entered without any of the signals he'd learned to read. She didn't pause in the doorway. She didn't scan the room to establish herself. She came in 4 minutes early, which Ryan noticed, because he noticed everything, walked directly to a seat in the back corner, set down her tablet, opened it, and began reading. No eye contact, no visible self-consciousness, no performance of belonging. She looked from where Ryan sat exactly like a support analyst, someone assigned to document the evaluation rather than participate in it. Someone from logistics or intelligence processing who had been attached to the program to provide technical assistance. He might have forgotten about her entirely, but then someone near the middle of the room shifted in their seat. Then another soldier. And Ryan followed the quiet movement of attention the way you follow a current, not by looking for the source immediately, but by watching where everyone else was looking first. They were looking at her patch. Ryan turned fully. 2 words stitched onto the uniform with the kind of clean precision that meant the designation was real, officially processed, and permanently recorded. Combat Master. He read it twice, because Combat Master wasn't a designation you saw often. It wasn't awarded regularly, wasn't given after a specific course, wasn't the kind of qualification that accumulated over time, like most military credentials. It was earned in the field under documented extreme combat conditions, verified by a chain of command that included oversight at levels most soldiers never interacted with, and held by fewer active duty personnel in the entire military than Ryan could count on both hands. He had met one person in his entire career who legitimately carried that qualification. One. And that person had 3 Purple Hearts, a classified operations file that ran 40 pages, and a physical presence that made new soldiers instinctively straighten their posture. Ryan looked at Natalie Brooks. She was reading her tablet. She hadn't looked up. She hadn't noticed or appeared not to notice that the room had quietly reorganized its attention around her. Something irritated Ryan in a way he didn't immediately identify. It wasn't the patch itself. It was the stillness, the complete absence of the posture he associated with that kind of qualification. If you had earned Combat Master, Ryan believed you carried yourself with a specific kind of gravity. You didn't sit in the back corner with a tablet as if you were waiting for a routine staff meeting. He heard himself speak before he fully decided to. Combat Master. The room went quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone says something that everyone was already thinking. Ryan kept his voice casual, measured, the tone of someone asking a question so simple it barely required asking. He looked at her directly. You. Several soldiers laughed. Not the loud, comfortable laughter of a shared joke. The cautious, relieved laughter of people who had privately had the same thought and were glad someone else had said it first. Natalie looked up from her tablet. She didn't flush. She didn't stiffen. She looked at Ryan the way a doctor looks at a patient who has just said something incorrect about their own diagnosis. Not with irritation, but with a kind of quiet, clinical patience. Ryan pointed at the patch. Is that a mistake? Natalie said nothing. That bothered him more than any response would have. He had expected one of two things. He had expected the reaction of someone who had been incorrectly decorated and knew it, a flinch, a hesitation, a careful explanation about how the designation worked, an attempt to soften or contextualize the credential. Or he had expected the reaction of someone who had legitimately earned it and had something to prove, a jaw tightening, a defensive straightening, a look that said, "Try me." He got neither. Natalie Brooks looked at him with total untroubled calm. Then she looked back at her tablet. Colonel Whitman cleared his throat. Let's begin. Ryan sat down slowly, but he didn't stop thinking about that patch. The briefing for Operation Iron Phantom was more complex than most of the soldiers in the room had anticipated. Whitman laid it out with the kind of precise, unhurried delivery that experienced commanders use when they want people to actually absorb the information rather than simply react to it. The exercise was a full-spectrum combat readiness evaluation, not a standard training scenario, a dynamic simulation system. The most advanced, the base had access to that used real-world operational data, adaptive AI behavioral modeling, and environmental variables drawn directly from documented combat theaters. The system was built to be unpredictable. It adapted to the choices made inside it. It learned in real time from tactical decisions and punished patterns. Soldiers who relied on familiar playbooks would fail. The only way to succeed was to think beyond the expected approach and adjust faster than the simulation could respond. Whitman explained this clearly. He explained it twice. Then he opened the floor for preliminary strategic discussion. Ryan stood. He had prepared for this. He always prepared. He walked the room through his team's proposed approach, a fast, aggressive push through the primary corridor maximum force application at the earliest contact point speed as a substitute for subtlety. It was the kind of strategy that worked in environments where overwhelming force could neutralize adaptive response before it developed. It had worked before. It had worked for him, specifically, in 2 documented field engagements that had contributed to commendations in his record. The room listened carefully. Several instructors nodded. The younger soldiers near the front were watching Ryan with the particular attentiveness of people who are deciding whether to trust someone. Then Natalie's voice came from the back of the room. There's a vulnerability in the Eastern approach. The room went quiet again, but differently this time. Not the cautious quiet of people waiting for something. The specific quiet of people who weren't sure whether to take her seriously. Ryan turned. "You have a concern." Natalie had set her tablet down. She was looking at the tactical map projected on the screen with a focus that suggested she had been studying it for longer than the briefing had been running. "The enemy AI isn't defending the eastern objective," she said. "It's baiting teams toward it." A few soldiers exchanged glances. Someone near the middle of the room shifted in their seat. Ryan kept his expression neutral. "You know this. How? I've run the scenario 11 times. The room waited. Ryan smiled slowly. 11 simulations. 11? She confirmed. He took a single step toward the screen. Not toward her. Toward the map. It was a deliberate movement, positioning himself as the person interpreting the information rather than responding to the challenge. "That's exactly the difference," he said, and his voice was pleasant. Genuinely pleasant, which was worse than contempt. "Some of us learn combat from experience, some from computers." A few soldiers laughed again. The same cautious, borrowed laughter. "The AI adapts to pressure patterns," Natalie said. Her voice was the same. Not louder, not more urgent. "What looks like a defended position is a feedback loop. The more force you apply to the eastern corridor, the more the system draws resources toward the surrounding positions. By the time the primary team reaches the objective, they'll be surrounded on 3 sides with no viable extraction route." Ryan studied her for a moment. She wasn't performing confidence. She wasn't trying to make him look bad. She was describing what she had observed with the precision of someone who had looked at the same data so many times that the conclusions had stopped being opinions and become facts. That, Ryan thought privately, was the most irritating part. "I appreciate the analysis," he said. He turned back to the screen. The briefing ended 40 minutes later. Ryan's strategy remained the primary approach. 3 other teams would run independent variations. Natalie would be assessed separately, which drew a few quiet comments from soldiers near the door as they filed out. Ryan overheard one of them. "Solo against that system. You see the patch she's wearing? I see a patch. Doesn't mean anything until you prove it." Ryan said nothing as he passed them, but he agreed. The following morning arrived with the particular energy that exists before any high-stakes evaluation. The observation area above the simulation floor filled early. Soldiers who weren't directly involved in the day's runs had come to watch. Some because they were genuinely invested in the results. Some because they had heard about what happened in the briefing room the day before and wanted to see how it resolved. Ryan's team went first. They were excellent. There was no other accurate description. Every movement was coordinated. Every communication was crisp and precise. Every tactical adjustment was made within the expected parameters of elite operational performance. Watching them, a person who understood combat would have had very little to criticize. They executed with the kind of confidence that comes from genuine competence, not performance. For 11 minutes, they were perfect. Then the simulation shifted. It happened exactly where Natalie had said it would. The eastern corridor, which had appeared lightly defended and logistically straightforward, suddenly compressed. The AI-controlled forces that had been positioned elsewhere in locations Ryan's team had marked as secondary and non-threatening began redirecting, not rushing. Repositioning with the calm efficiency of a system that had already predicted the team's movements and was simply confirming them. Ryan watched from the observation room. He watched his team try to adjust. He watched them apply the kind of tactical flexibility that had gotten them through real engagements, and he watched the simulation respond to each adjustment with something that looked disturbingly like anticipation. The system wasn't reacting to them. It was completing a sequence it had already begun. And Ryan's team, despite everything they knew and everything they were capable of, could not outrun the trap that had already closed around them. The final assessment appeared on the screen. Mission failed. The room on the observation level was very quiet. Ryan stood at the glass and stared at the screen for a long moment. His jaw was set. His expression was controlled. But something behind his eyes had changed, and the soldiers standing nearest to him could see it even if they didn't name it. He had been wrong. Not about his team's capability. His team was as good as he believed they were. He had been wrong about the scenario. He had been wrong about the approach. He had been warned precisely and calmly by the woman he had publicly dismissed in front of everyone in that briefing room, and he had dismissed the warning. The door to the observation room opened. Colonel Whitman stepped in. "Sergeant Brooks will run next," Whitman said. The room settled into a different kind of quiet. One of the instructors near the back spoke under his breath. "Solo run against that system, after watching what just happened." Nobody responded. Below, through the observation glass, the simulation floor reset, and Natalie Brooks walked in alone. She entered without looking up at the observation level. She didn't acknowledge the audience. She didn't appear to perform the kind of deliberate visible composure that some soldiers used as a form of psychological positioning before high-pressure evaluations. She simply entered the space, stopped in the center of it for exactly 3 seconds, and then began to move. What happened next was the thing that changed the room. She didn't go toward the objective. Every team before her, Ryan's included, had oriented immediately toward the mission objective. That was the logical starting point. You knew where the endpoint was, so you moved toward it and handled obstacles as they arose. It was the most natural approach. It was also the room was slowly beginning to understand exactly what the system wanted. Natalie went sideways. She moved along the western edge of the simulation space, paused near a position that looked from the observation level like nothing. No tactical significance, no visible resources, no obvious reason to stop. And she observed it for 45 seconds. Just observed. Not interacting. Not engaging. Watching. "What is she doing?" someone muttered behind Ryan. Ryan didn't answer. He was watching her too closely. She moved again, northeast this time. Another stop. Another extended period of observation that looked to most of the room like hesitation, like confusion, like someone who didn't know what she was doing and was trying to figure it out in real time. "She's going to fail faster than we did," one of the soldiers said. But Ryan had stopped agreeing with that instinctively, because he was watching her move, and there was something in the pattern, something he couldn't fully articulate yet, but something his 20 years of experience was registering below conscious thought that felt less like confusion and more like a different language. Like she was reading something that wasn't visible to the people watching. Like the space she was moving through contained information that she had already learned how to hear. She stopped again. Then for the first time, she spoke. Not loudly, but the observation room's audio system picked it up clearly. "There," she said. To no one. Or perhaps to herself. Or perhaps to the system which Ryan was beginning to suspect she understood in a way that made that distinction less meaningful than it seemed. The simulation's AI units, which had been distributed across the environment in positions that Ryan's tactical assessment had identified as defensive, began to move. They moved exactly where she'd positioned herself to watch them move. And then Natalie Brooks stopped observing. She started acting. And for the next 22 minutes, the observation room above the Fort Blackridge simulation floor watched something that none of them would fully describe accurately when they tried to explain it later. Not because it was too fast to follow, because it was too deliberate. Because every action she took looked in retrospect like it had been chosen before she took it. Because the threats that materialized around her appeared to have been anticipated before they materialized. Because the civilians in the simulation, a variable that most teams treated as secondary complications, were protected by positioning decisions she had made before anyone in the observation room had even noticed the civilians were there. She was not fighting the simulation. She was operating inside it, the way someone operates inside a system they built themselves. The mission completion screen appeared. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Ryan turned away from the glass and found Colonel Whitman standing directly behind him. Whitman was watching him with an expression that was impossible to read. "Sir," Ryan said. His voice was controlled, but the word came out with a texture it hadn't had the day before. "You have a question." Whitman said. It wasn't a question. Ryan looked back at the glass. Natalie was standing in the center of the simulation floor, looking at something in the middle distance, with the same stillness she'd brought into the briefing room. The same absence of performance. The same complete, untroubled quiet. Who is she? Ryan said. Whitman was quiet for a moment. That's actually what I'm about to explain to everyone, he said. And I need you in the room for it. Ryan followed him. But as he walked, he carried something with him that he hadn't walked in with. The specific, uncomfortable weight of a man who has just discovered that the thing he was most certain about was the thing he was most wrong about. And the harder question, the one he couldn't quite push away, was not about Natalie Brooks at all. It was about himself. About what else he had dismissed. About how many times he had looked at something and decided what it was before it had a chance to show him. About whether the habits of 20 years had taught him to see clearly or had taught him to see quickly, and whether those two things were as similar as he had always believed. He walked into the briefing room, and he sat down for the second time in 2 days. But this time, he sat in a different kind of silence. Not the competitive silence of someone calculating his position. The listening silence of someone who has just realized he doesn't have all the information. Whitman moved to the front of the room. Natalie was already there. She sat in the same back corner as before. Same tablet. Same stillness. Ryan looked at her patch. Combat Master. 2 words that he had turned into a joke in front of 40 people. 2 words that he was beginning to understand he had not earned the right to doubt. Whitman opened a classified file on the projector. And the room changed. Whitman didn't open the file immediately. He stood at the front of the room with his hand resting on the edge of the table, and he looked at the soldiers assembled in front of him, the way a man looks at something he has been waiting a long time to say. There was no performance in it, no build-up designed to manufacture tension, just the particular stillness of someone who understood that what he was about to reveal would rearrange the way everyone in the room understood the last 48 hours. Before I open this file, Whitman said, I want every person in this room to think about one thing. Nobody spoke. Think about what you said, what you thought, what conclusions you drew the moment she walked in yesterday. Ryan didn't move, but the words landed on him the way words land when they're aimed precisely at something you were hoping nobody noticed. Because what I'm about to show you is going to make those conclusions very expensive. He opened the file. The projector screen changed. A photograph appeared first. Not a portrait, not a formal military headshot, but a field photograph. Grainy. Low resolution. The kind of image captured under conditions where image quality was the last consideration. It showed a soldier in full tactical gear, moving through terrain that the image couldn't fully resolve, surrounded by other soldiers who were clearly following rather than leading. The soldier at the front was Natalie Brooks. The timestamp in the corner of the photograph was 4 years old. Staff Sergeant Natalie Brooks, Whitman said, has been operating under a restricted identity classification for the past 31 months. Her assignment to this base is temporary. Her actual designation is not Staff Sergeant. He paused. That's the rank we use when we need her to move through standard military environments without triggering questions above the level of clearance in the room. The silence in the briefing room became a different kind of silence. The kind that happens when people are simultaneously processing information and trying not to show how much the information is affecting them. Ryan looked at Natalie. She was looking at the photograph on the screen. Her expression was unreadable. Not because she was hiding something, because she had looked at this moment enough times, the moment when the file opened and the room rearranged itself around her, that she had reached a place beyond reaction. Her Combat Master qualification, Whitman continued, was earned during Operation Silent Horizon, 31 months ago, a classified operation in a theater I'm not going to name in this room today. He looked at the assembled soldiers. What I will tell you is what the after-action report documented. He advanced the slide. A mission map appeared, heavily redacted. Most of the geographic identifiers were blacked out, but the tactical overlay was intact: unit positions, movement vectors, engagement zones marked in red that covered most of the visible area. A 6-person special operations team was inserted for a targeted intelligence retrieval mission. 40 minutes into the operation, they made contact with an enemy force whose size and positioning had not been accurately assessed in the pre-mission intelligence. Whitman tapped the screen. The team leader, Captain Marcus Webb, took a round in the first exchange of fire, serious but non-fatal. He lost consciousness 40 seconds into the engagement and did not regain full function for 19 hours. Someone in the middle of the room shifted. At that point, with the team leader incapacitated and the team pinned in a position with no viable extraction route, Staff Sergeant Brooks assumed command. Ryan heard someone behind him exhale slowly. She held that position for 72 hours. The number sat in the room, not the kind of number that gets responded to immediately. The kind that requires a moment of translation. 72 hours, 3 days, against overwhelming enemy presence in a compromised position with a 6-person team, one of whom was incapacitated, and one of whom Whitman noted almost as an aside had sustained a secondary injury in the first 2 hours that reduced effective fighting capability to 4 people. Every member of that team came home, Whitman said. He said it simply, without emphasis, which was the right way to say it because the emphasis was already built into the words. Every member. Ryan was very still. He was thinking about the briefing room yesterday. He was thinking about his own voice. He was thinking about the way the room had laughed, that cautious, borrowed laughter that he had permitted, that he had generated, that he had aimed at a woman who had kept 6 people alive for 3 days, in a situation where the expected outcome was that none of them survived. The Combat Master designation was awarded 8 weeks after the operation concluded, Whitman said. It was the fastest processing of that qualification in the history of the program. The review board's documentation included a statement from every surviving team member from Captain Webb and from the theater commander who debriefed the team upon extraction. He paused. I'll read you one line from that documentation. The room waited. Whitman looked down at the file. Quote, Brooks demonstrated a command capability, tactical intelligence, and psychological resilience under sustained extreme duress that this board has not previously encountered in a review of this kind. End quote. Nobody said anything. Ryan became aware with a clarity that felt almost physical that his coffee was still sitting on the table in front of him, and he had not touched it in 40 minutes. Whitman closed the file. Not completely, he left it open on the desk, as if the information needed to remain accessible even after he stopped speaking from it. He looked at the room the way he had looked at it when he began. She is also, Whitman said, the primary architect of the simulation system you use today. That was the thing that broke the silence, not dramatically, not with raised voices or visible shock, but with the specific involuntary sound of a room full of disciplined people who had lost their grip on composure for exactly 1 second before reasserting it. Ryan heard himself say, the simulation system. It wasn't a question. It was a man reading back words to confirm that he had heard them correctly. The combat scenario architecture, the AI behavioral modeling, the adaptive response parameters. Whitman looked at Ryan directly. The Eastern Corridor trap that your team walked into was drawn from direct operational experience. It's not a hypothetical scenario. It's a documented enemy behavior pattern that Brooks identified and formalized after encountering it under live fire conditions. Ryan looked at the screen, at the redacted mission map, at the red engagement zones. He thought about Natalie saying the enemy AI isn't defending the eastern objective, it's baiting teams toward it. He thought about himself walking toward the projection screen and saying, some of us learn combat from experience. He thought about the room laughing. Sir? It was Lieutenant Carver seated 2 positions to Ryan's left, young, sharp, the kind of officer who was good enough to ask the questions that more senior people were reluctant to ask. Why wasn't this information part of the initial briefing? Whitman looked at him. Because the evaluation wasn't only of the simulation, Whitman said. It was of the room. The silence came back, harder this time. What you demonstrated yesterday in this briefing and in the observation room this morning is something that happens consistently in integrated assessments. We bring someone in with an exceptional record, no visible performance display, and we watch what the room does with them." He paused. "It tells us things about unit culture that performance metrics don't capture." Carver sat back slowly. Ryan didn't move. He was looking at this back corner of the room, at Natalie, who was still looking at the screen, still holding the same stillness she'd held since she walked in the day before. As if the conversation happening about her was a weather pattern she'd already passed through enough times to stop bracing against. Ryan made a decision. It was not an easy decision. It was the kind that requires a person to override something deep and habitual and private, something built over years of being the person who didn't need to make that particular kind of decision. He stood up, not to perform the gesture, not because the room was watching. He stood up because sitting down felt in that moment like a continuation of something he wanted to stop. "Sergeant Brooks." Natalie turned from the screen and looked at him. The room watched. "I owe you a correction," Ryan said. His voice was level, not falsely humble, not performed. The voice of a man who had learned something at a cost he was still calculating. "What I said yesterday was wrong. What I permitted in this room yesterday was wrong. I made a judgment about your qualification before I had any basis to make it. That was my failure, not anyone else's." Natalie held his gaze. For a moment, she said nothing, and Ryan had the uncomfortable experience of not knowing what that silence meant, which was not a position he was accustomed to. Then she said, "Sit down, Sergeant Cole." Her voice was not cold. It was not punishing. It carried none of the satisfaction that he had braced himself for, none of the weight of someone using a moment of acknowledged wrongness to establish a new dominance. She just said it the way someone says it when they want to continue the meeting. Ryan sat. The evaluation identified a weakness in the unit's approach that goes beyond the simulation, Natalie said. She was speaking to the room now, but not in the way that meant she had forgotten Ryan. She was speaking in the way that meant she had moved past the personal element because the professional element was more important. The issue isn't that the Eastern approach failed. The issue is that the warning was available and was dismissed. That dismissal wasn't random. It followed a pattern. She looked around the room. How many people in here heard what I said yesterday and privately agreed that the Eastern corridor was a risk? Silence. Then slowly a hand went up in the middle of the room. Lieutenant Carver. Then another soldier seated near the far wall. Then two more. 4, Natalie said. Out of 41 people in this room, 4 privately agreed with an assessment that turned out to be accurate, and none of them said so. She paused. That's not a training problem. That's a communication problem. And that communication problem in a live operational environment costs lives. The room was very quiet. She wasn't lecturing. She wasn't performing authority. She was presenting a problem the way an engineer presents a structural failure, not to establish blame, but to establish cause so that the cause could be addressed. The simulation system was designed to test exactly this, she continued. Not just tactical competence, not just individual skill. The adaptive AI isn't only modeling enemy behavior, it's modeling the decision-making patterns of the team running against it. When a team suppresses internal dissent, the AI learns the resulting pattern in about 3 to 4 minutes and begins exploiting the predictability that groupthink creates. Ryan understood then fully completely in the way understanding arrives when it has been building slowly and then resolves all at once why she had run the scenario 11 times. She hadn't been studying the simulation to find the right approach. She had been studying the simulation because she built it, and she was confirming that it was doing what she designed it to do. And it was. "I want to run the scenario again," Ryan said. Natalie looked at him. "Not to fix my team's score," he said quickly. "To understand what we missed and why we missed it. If this system is trained to identify the patterns I'm describing, I want to know what pattern we were running." Whitman looked at Natalie. Natalie considered for a moment. Then she nodded once. After the full debrief. The debrief ran for 3 hours. It was unlike any debrief Ryan had participated in before. Not because the format was different, because the substance was different. Natalie walked through the simulation with a precision that bordered on surgical, not reviewing what had happened, but explaining why each decision point existed in the scenario design, what behavioral data it was drawn from, and what the adaptive system had identified in Ryan's team's pattern within the first 6 minutes that had made the Eastern Corridor trap inevitable rather than possible. "Here," she said, pointing to a timestamp on the replay. "This is when the system committed to the containment sequence. Your team made a communication call that prioritized speed over information at this point. The AI flagged that as a predictability marker and began redirecting resources 12 seconds later." 12 seconds, one of the team members said. His name was Sergeant Torres, and he had been one of the best performers in the simulation. He was also one of the people who had laughed in the briefing room. He didn't look like someone who was doing math on that correlation, but Ryan suspected he was. "The system doesn't wait for confirmation," Natalie said. "It acts on probability. When a team signals its pattern early, the simulation treats it as commitment rather than tendency. That's how it works against experienced operators more effectively than against less experienced ones. Experienced teams are more consistent. Consistency is predictable. The system rewards improvisation over habit." Torres leaned forward. "So the better you are, the easier you are to trap." "In a rigid sense, yes," Natalie said. "Excellence without adaptability becomes a vulnerability. You know what works, you trust what works, and the moment your trust exceeds your observation, the system has you." Ryan watched Natalie during the 3 hours of the debrief. He watched her the way he should have watched her from the beginning, not to evaluate whether she belonged in the room, but to understand what she was doing in it. What she was doing was teaching. Not because she had been asked to teach, because the information that needed to be transmitted was information she had, and the room needed it, and she was the person in the room who understood that the most efficient path forward was to transmit it as clearly as possible, regardless of whether the audience had initially respected the source. She had never been trying to prove herself. She had been trying to complete the mission, and the mission, Ryan slowly understood, had never been the simulation. The mission had been this room, this debrief, these soldiers. Getting them to a place where they could operate more effectively by understanding a weakness they hadn't known they had. The Combat Master Patch was not a declaration. It was a tool, a way of ensuring she had access to the people and the rooms she needed to reach to do the work she actually came to do. She had been assigned to this base not to run the evaluation. She had been assigned to conduct it. After the debrief, the room cleared in stages. Some soldiers left immediately. Others moved in small groups, talking quietly with the careful tone of people who were revising something they had believed and hadn't fully revised yet. Torres stopped near the door and looked back once, then left without saying anything. Ryan sat until most of the others had gone. Natalie was collecting her materials at the front of the room. He walked toward her. She didn't look up, but she didn't tense either. She had known he was still there. "I've been in this for 20 years, he said. He wasn't looking for absolution. He said it as a statement of fact context, not excuse. "I thought I knew what that meant, what I'd learned, what I could read." Natalie finished what she was doing and looked at him. "You do know things," she said. 20 years of what you've done is not nothing. It's never nothing. The mistake wasn't that you trusted your experience." She paused. "The mistake was that you stopped there." Ryan felt the weight of that settle somewhere that performance couldn't reach. "How long," he said, "has this been happening?" People questioning the patch. Natalie almost smiled. Not quite. But something in her expression moved. "Since the day I got it," she said. "It's always the same room, Sergeant Cole. Different faces. Same room. And you never explain yourself." "Explanation is a performance," she said. "And I'm not here to perform." She picked up her tablet. "I'm here to do the work." Ryan nodded slowly. There was nothing to say to that wouldn't diminish it. She moved toward the door. "Sergeant Brooks?" She stopped, turned. "The rerun," he said. "Tomorrow. I'd like your input on approach before we run it, not after." Natalie looked at him for a moment. not assessing, confirming. 0600, she said. She walked out. Ryan stood in the empty briefing room for a long moment. He looked at the projection screen, now dark, at the chairs where 41 soldiers had sat and heard things that would rearrange at varying speeds and depths the way they understood their own assumptions. At the spot in the back corner where Natalie had been sitting when he first looked at her patch and turned it into a question mark. He thought about the after-action documentation Whitman had quoted, the review board's language, a command capability and tactical intelligence this board has not previously encountered. He thought about the briefing room yesterday, his voice, the laughter, and he thought about something his first commanding officer had told him 15 years ago during a moment that Ryan had not fully understood at the time. The most dangerous thing in this work, that commander had said, is not the enemy. It's the moment you believe you already know what you're looking at. Ryan had nodded at the time and filed it alongside every other lesson delivered in that format. Wise-sounding, abstract, the kind of thing that felt important until the specific situation that proved it hadn't arrived yet. It had taken 15 years, and it had taken Natalie Brooks sitting in a back corner with a tablet, not looking up for him to understand what it actually meant. He picked up his coffee from the table. Cold now. Left untouched through 3 hours of debrief and everything that came before it. He drank it anyway. Because some things you finish, not because they're still good, but because leaving them unfinished feels wrong. He would be at 0600, and this time he would listen first. Ryan was at the simulation floor at 5:53. He told himself it was habit. He always arrived early, but he knew standing there in the low light with 7 minutes to spare that it wasn't habit this time. It was something closer to accountability. The specific, uncomfortable need to be present before he was required to be, as if arriving first could begin to repair something that punctuality alone could never actually fix. Natalie was already there. Of course she was. She was standing at the edge of the simulation floor with her tablet in her left hand and her right hand resting loosely at her side, looking at the environment with the same focused stillness Ryan had watched through the observation glass the day before. Not pacing, not reviewing notes, just looking. The way someone looks at a thing they built and are checking whether it is still doing what they designed it to do. Ryan stopped beside her. Not too close. The appropriate distance of someone who understood that he was in this context, and by his own making the person entering her space rather than the other way around. "You designed this whole floor," he asked. "The behavioral architecture," she said. "The physical layout was here before I arrived. I reconfigured the AI response logic and the environmental variable systems." "How long did that take?" She glanced at him briefly. 4 months of primary design, another 6 weeks of field testing with volunteer teams. And the Eastern Corridor trap. "Was the last thing I added," she said. "I almost didn't include it." Ryan looked at the floor. "Why did you—" Natalie was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, considering. There was a difference, and Ryan was beginning to learn to read it. "Because I watched it happen once," she said, "in a real environment, with real people. A team that was good, genuinely good, the way your team is good, walked straight into a position that someone had told them was dangerous because the person who told them didn't match what they expected a warning to look like." Ryan didn't ask her what happened to that team. The way she said it made the answer unnecessary. "So you built it in," he said. "I built it in," she confirmed. "Because a training environment that only tests what you already know how to do isn't a training environment. It's a performance stage." They stood in silence for a moment. Not the uncomfortable silence of the briefing room, not the loaded silence of the observation level. Something quieter. The silence of two people who were beginning carefully and without ceremony to understand each other. Torres arrived at 5:58, followed by the rest of Ryan's team in close succession. They came in with the particular energy of soldiers who had slept on something difficult and arrived ready to address it, not because the sleep had resolved anything, but because it had given the difficulty enough distance to approach. Torres looked at Natalie, then at Ryan, then back at Natalie. "Sergeant Brooks," he said. "Just the name." but the way he said it carried everything he wasn't saying, which was considerably more than the two words themselves. "Sergeant Torres," Natalie said. She didn't make it easy for him, and she didn't make it hard. She just received the acknowledgement and moved forward. "We're going to run the scenario again," Ryan said to the assembled team. "Same parameters. No modifications to the system." He looked at Natalie. "And this time, Sergeant Brooks is going to walk us through her initial assessment before we begin. Not after. Before." The team settled. Ryan watched their faces and saw the thing he'd been hoping to see. Not full trust, not yet, but the specific attentiveness of people who had been wrong and had enough discipline to let that fact change their behavior rather than their excuse. Natalie set her tablet on the edge of the floor boundary and turned to face them. "The first thing the system looks for," she said, "is your opening decision. Not your strategy, your decision-making process. There's a difference. Strategy is what you do. Process is how you decide what to do. The AI is calibrated to read process, because process is consistent even when strategy varies." One of the team members, Specialist Darren Walsh, raised his hand slightly. "How does it read process? We're not narrating our decisions out loud." "You don't have to," Natalie said. "Your movement patterns narrate them for you. The speed of your first directional commitment, the distance between individual team members during initial movement, whether you move toward the objective or toward information first." She paused. "Your team moved toward the objective within 40 seconds of entry. That's a process signature. It tells the system you've already decided that speed is the priority, which means information gathering will be compressed, which means your awareness of secondary positioning will be incomplete." Walsh looked like he was doing math and not loving the results. "So what's the counter?" Torres asked. "Stop," Natalie said. Torres blinked. "Stop. For approximately 90 seconds after entry. Don't move toward the objective. Don't move toward known contact positions. Stop and observe. Let the system register that your team hasn't committed to a directional pattern yet. It disrupts the initial calibration sequence and forces the AI to begin a reassessment cycle rather than confirming its predicted model." 90 seconds feels like a long time when the clock is running, Torres said. 90 seconds feels like a long time when you're watching. Natalie agreed. In the system, 90 seconds of genuine observation is worth approximately 14 minutes of reactive adjustment after you've already been patterned. Torres absorbed that. Ryan watched him absorb it. Watched the resistance in Torres's expression. The instinctive pushback of someone who had spent a career learning that hesitation costs time and time costs objectives, work through the friction of what Natalie had just said, and arrive somewhere more complicated on the other side. "What else?" Ryan said. "Information hierarchy," Natalie said. "When your team gets a warning from any source, the system clocks how long it takes that warning to influence behavior. Yesterday, a warning was issued 18 minutes before the scenario began. It was not acted on. The AI factored that communication failure into its model and assumed that your team's information integration lag was high enough to exploit." The room was very quiet. "The system is smarter than your tactics," Natalie said. "It's not smarter than your honesty. The only thing it can't adapt to is a team that tells each other the truth fast enough to act on it." Ryan felt something in those words that went beyond the technical context. He suspected the team felt it too, because the quiet that followed was the kind that happens when something lands below the professional level and touches something more personal. He was about to speak when his radio crackled. Whitman's voice. "Cole, Brooks, my office, now." The tone was the specific tone of a commanding officer who had received information that required immediate response. Ryan and Natalie exchanged a look. It was the first time he'd seen her expression shift toward something he could read as uncertainty, not fear, not confusion, but the recognition of a variable she hadn't accounted for. They left the team on the floor and moved through the base at a pace that wasn't quite running, but wasn't anything close to casual. Whitman's office door was open. He was standing behind his desk, not sitting. There was a phone on speaker on the desk, and a second officer in the room, Colonel Patricia Shen, the regional oversight commander whose presence at Fort Blackridge was not scheduled, and whose expression when Ryan and Natalie entered communicated that whatever had brought her there had happened recently. "Close the door," Whitman said. Ryan closed it. "We have a situation," Whitman said. He looked at Natalie. "Operation Silent Horizon has been reopened." The air in the room changed. Ryan didn't fully understand what that meant, but he watched Natalie's face and understood that she did, and that the understanding was not neutral. "Reopened how?" Natalie said. Her voice was the same as it always was, level-controlled, professionally inflected, but there was something beneath it now. Something that took Ryan a moment to identify, because he hadn't heard it from her before. It was weight, not fear, not anger. Something older and more complicated. The weight of someone hearing the name of something they survived being spoken again in a context that required them to engage with it professionally while carrying it personally. "The intelligence retrieved during the operation has surfaced in active communications," Shen said. Her voice was clipped efficient. She was the kind of officer who delivered information the way a surgeon makes an incision precisely without excess. 3 separate intercepts in the past 10 days. The material was supposed to be contained. It wasn't. "The source of the compromise," Natalie said. Shen looked at her directly. "Unconfirmed, which is why we're here." Ryan looked from Shen to Whitman to Natalie and made himself stay quiet. He was the most junior person in this room in terms of relevant context, and he was old enough and experienced enough to know what that meant. It meant he listened, completely, without inserting himself until there was a reason to. "The team from Silent Horizon," Natalie said. Her voice had not changed, but Ryan caught the smallest pause before she continued. "Is everyone accounted for?" "As of this morning," Whitman said. "Yes." Natalie nodded once, and Ryan saw something move through her so quickly that he would have missed it if he hadn't been watching carefully. Not relief, exactly. The specific exhale of someone who had asked a question they were afraid of the answer to and received the best possible response, but could not fully relax, because best possible was not the same as resolved. "Then the compromise is documentary," she said. "Post-operation reporting chain." Shen said, "That's the working assumption. The tactical data or the personnel files." "Personnel," Shen said. "Specifically the team roster and the command transition documentation." And there it was. Ryan understood before Natalie said anything else. The command transition documentation was the paper trail that recorded her assumption of command after Captain Webb was incapacitated. It was the document that proved she had led the team. It was the document that formed the evidentiary foundation of her combat master qualification. If that documentation had surfaced in active enemy communications, it wasn't just a security breach. It was a targeting problem. "They know your name," Ryan said. It came out quietly, not as a conclusion he was presenting, as a realization arriving in real time. Natalie looked at him. "They would have known my name from the moment they filed the interception. That's not new information." "But now someone else knows they know it," Ryan said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to Whitman. "What's the operational recommendation?" "Reassignment is on the table," Whitman said. "Immediate. If your identity has been surfaced in this context, maintaining the restricted classification at this installation becomes significantly more complicated." "I haven't finished what I came here to do," Natalie said. Whitman looked at her. "That's a conversation for you and Colonel Shen. I've said what I can say in this room." Shen moved toward the door, a clear signal that the larger conversation was about to become smaller. She paused, looked at Ryan. "Sergeant Cole, you're dismissed." Ryan looked at Natalie. She was already turning toward Shen. Whatever was about to happen in the next conversation was beyond his clearance and above his involvement, and she didn't need him to stay. She didn't need anything from him right now. She was exactly what she had been when she walked into the briefing room 2 days ago, Complete self-contained, operating within herself at a level that didn't require external support to function. He walked out. But the door didn't close all the way before he heard Natalie say one more thing. "The reassignment can wait 48 hours, she said. "I need 2 days. He didn't hear Shen's response. The door clicked shut behind him, and he was in the hallway with the sound of his own footsteps and the particular weight of a man who has just stepped into the periphery of something much larger than a training evaluation. He went back to the simulation floor. The team was there, waiting, looking at him with the expressions of soldiers who knew something had changed upstairs but didn't know what, and were practicing the discipline of not speculating aloud until they had information worth speculating about. "Change of plan," Ryan said. "Sergeant Brooks has been pulled for a command consultation. We're running the scenario independently, using the approach she outlined this morning." Torres looked at the door, then at Ryan. "Is she coming back?" "I don't know," Ryan said. "Honestly. We're running it as if she isn't." Torres absorbed that, then he nodded. 90 seconds, he said. 90 seconds, Ryan confirmed. They ran the scenario. Ryan stopped the team 4 seconds after entry. Not 90. 4. Because 90 felt wrong, felt dangerous, felt exposed, and it took every piece of what he'd heard in the last 2 days to override the instinct to move and hold the team in place for the full count. Nobody spoke during those 90 seconds. It was the loudest 90 seconds Ryan had experienced in recent memory. Loud in the way silence gets loud when people are fighting their own conditioning to maintain it. He could feel the team around him doing exactly what he was doing, pushing against years of trained response, against the instinct that said, movement is progress and stillness is vulnerability. At second 64, Walsh made a quiet sound. Not a word. Just the small, involuntary sound of someone whose entire nervous system was voting against staying still. Ryan said nothing. At second 89, he saw what Natalie had seen the day before. Not with her precision, not with the layered built-in understanding of someone who had designed the system, but with the simple surface-level recognition that comes from knowing what to look for. The Eastern Corridor's defensive positioning was wrong. Too clean. Too organized. The AI units were too perfectly placed, which meant they hadn't arrived at those positions organically through the scenario's progression. They had been placed to be noticed, to invite engagement. It was exactly as described, a baited position. West, Ryan said. The team moved. What followed was not a clean run. It was not elegant. It was the specific, effortful imperfection of a team trying to apply a new framework in real time with incomplete internalization of its principles. They made 3 decisions that Ryan later identified as residual pattern habits. Moments where the team defaulted to familiar approaches despite the new direction. Each time the simulation registered it, and each time Ryan caught it and called it, and the team adjusted. The adjustment cost them time. It cost them smoothness. But it did not cost them the mission. 1 hour and 4 minutes after entry, the mission completion signal appeared. Torres stood at Ryan's left and looked at the screen for a long moment. "We did that," he said. "We did part of it," Ryan said. "She did the rest." Torres turned toward him. "You know what bothers me? Tell me." "She knew yesterday," Torres said. "She knew exactly how that scenario would go for us, and she tried to tell us, and we laughed." He paused. I laughed. Ryan said nothing. "I've been in this for 11 years, Torres said. "I thought I had a pretty good idea of what I was looking at when I looked at people." He shook his head. "I was looking at the wrong things." "We all were," Ryan said. "Does that fix it?" Ryan looked at him. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. "No. Knowing you made a mistake and making it right are 2 different things. Understanding is not the same as repair." He paused. Repair takes time, and it takes behavior. Not words. Torres nodded slowly. Walsh appeared at Ryan's right shoulder. What happened upstairs with Shen being here? Ryan had thought about how to answer this if it came up. The answer he landed on was simple and accurate, without containing anything above the room's clearance level. Sergeant Brooks has operational commitments that extend beyond this installation. There are questions about the timeline of her assignment here. Walsh processed that. So she might not finish what she started. Might not, Ryan said. Walsh was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Ryan didn't expect. I hope she does. I think I was just starting to understand what she was actually teaching us. Ryan looked at him. Walsh was 26. He'd been in for 4 years. He was good, precise, physically capable, technically skilled. He had been one of the people who laughed in the briefing room, but he had also been one of the people who spent 3 hours in the debrief taking notes. What do you think she was teaching us? Ryan asked. Walsh thought about it. That competence isn't loud, he said, and that being certain about something isn't the same as being right about it. Ryan was going to respond when the door to the simulation floor opened. Natalie walked in. The team looked at her. She walked with the same economy she always used, no unnecessary movement, no performance of arrival. She came in, assessed the room, saw the mission completion display, still active on the screen, and stopped. She looked at Ryan. You ran it, she said. We ran it, he said. She looked at the screen again, then back at the team. Something shifted in her expression fractionally briefly that Ryan had learned enough to recognize as the closest thing she allowed herself to visible satisfaction. How was the 90 seconds? She asked. Terrible, Torres said immediately. Natalie almost smiled. It always is? But it worked, Torres added. So, she nodded. Just once. Ryan crossed the floor toward her, close enough for the conversation to stay between them. You got the 2 days, I got the 2 days, she said. And after, she looked at him, not evasively, directly in the way she did everything without decoration, without softening. After is after, she said. Right now we have 47 hours and change, and there's a second scenario I need to run with your team before I can file the full evaluation. What's the second scenario? Ryan asked. The one where the enemy already knows your pattern, she said, because they've been watching you run the first one. Ryan held her gaze. That was not, he understood, a hypothetical. That was what was waiting for them on the other side of whatever had been in Whitman's office. Whatever had been in Shen's expression. Whatever had prompted the reopening of Operation Silent Horizon and the surfacing of documents that should never have traveled beyond a classified archive. Someone had been watching. And now the question wasn't whether Natalie Brooks could outthink a simulation system. The question was whether she could outthink whoever had designed the trap waiting for her outside this building. Ryan said, "Tell me what you need." Natalie said, "I need your team to be better than they were yesterday." She looked at Torres, at Walsh, at the rest of the assembled soldiers. "And I need you to start now," she said. The second scenario started without a countdown. That was the first thing Natalie changed. No timer on the wall, no visible clock, no external signal marking the beginning so the team could orient their internal rhythm around a number. She told them to enter the simulation floor, told them to begin when they were ready, and then she went to the observation room without another word. Torres looked at Ryan. "No clock." "No clock?" Ryan confirmed. "That's deliberate. Everything she does is deliberate." Walsh was already moving toward the entry point, not rushing, but with the kind of forward momentum that communicated he had internalized at least part of what the morning had taught them. The rest of the team followed. Ryan went last. And as he crossed the threshold into the simulation environment, he understood what Natalie had meant by the second scenario, the one where the enemy already knows your pattern. Because from the moment they entered, something felt different. Not wrong exactly. Familiar. The layout was the same. The environmental variables were consistent with the first scenario, but the AI positioning was different in a way Ryan couldn't immediately articulate, different in the specific, unsettling way that a room feels different when you know someone has been in it while you were gone, but you can't identify exactly what they moved. "Something's off," Torres said quietly. "Stay with the 90 seconds, Ryan said. They stopped, held the position, and this time the 90 seconds felt even longer because the environment felt like it was watching them back, which was precisely what Natalie had said it would do when the simulation had been preloaded with their behavioral data from the first run. At second 41, Walsh said, "West won't work." Ryan turned his head. "What?" "The western approach. It's blocked. The positions that were open this morning, they're covered now." Walsh's voice was controlled, but there was an undercurrent in it. The specific frequency of someone who is working hard to stay analytical in a situation their instincts are flagging as dangerous. "She said the scenario is designed for an enemy who already watched us complete the first run. They would have covered the route we used." Ryan held. Because Walsh was right, and because the correct response to Walsh being right was not immediate action. The correct response was to sit inside the rightness of that assessment for long enough to extract the next logical step rather than react to the surface-level conclusion. "So the second run isn't a modified version of the first run," Ryan said slowly. "It's a completely different problem," Torres said. "Using the same space," Walsh added. Ryan looked at the environment, at the positions he could see, and the positions he knew were there based on the previous run, at the geometry of a situation that had been designed to invalidate the solution they had just found. And he thought about what Natalie had said. Not the tactical content, the frame, the thing underneath the content. The only thing the system can't adapt to is a team that tells each other the truth fast enough to act on it. "Talk," Ryan said to the team. "Everything you're seeing, everything you're thinking, don't filter it, say it out loud." There was a brief hesitation, the residual instinct of soldiers who had been trained that uncertainty is a weakness to manage privately. Then Torres spoke. Then Walsh. Then the others in rapid succession, each observation building on the previous one, the picture assembling in real time through collective observation, rather than individual assessment, followed by selective disclosure. 3 minutes into the second scenario, Ryan's team was doing something they had not fully done in the first run in the debrief, or in any of the years of service that preceded this moment. They were thinking together. Above them in the observation room, Natalie watched. She had a notepad in front of her. She wasn't looking at it. She was watching the team move, watching the communication pattern, watching the specific quality of the exchanges between soldiers who were learning in real time under pressure that shared uncertainty was faster than individual certainty. Whitman stood beside her. 48 hours, he said quietly. That's what Shen agreed to. I know what I agreed to, Natalie said. And after that, she didn't take her eyes off the floor below. After that depends on what the next 12 hours tell us about the compromise. Whitman was quiet for a moment. The intercept team found a second layer this morning, before you came back to the floor. Natalie turned from the window. Whitman's expression was the expression of a man who had spent 30 years delivering difficult information and had never fully developed immunity to the weight of it. The personnel files weren't the only thing that surfaced. There's a secondary document in the intercept chain, after-action supplemental, filed 6 weeks after the primary report. Natalie was very still. What's in it? She said. The names of the civilian assets, Whitman said. The ones you used during the 72 hours. The local contact network that kept the team's position from being reported to the main enemy force. The floor below them continued. Ryan's team moved through the simulation. Walsh called out a position. Torres adjusted. The communication was clean and fast. But Natalie was no longer fully watching them. She was running a different calculation entirely. Those people, she said. Her voice was careful, precise. The voice she used when the content of what she was saying required the container to be absolutely controlled. They were promised anonymity. The documentation was supposed to be sealed at the highest classification level. Their names should not exist in any file that could surface in an active intercept. They shouldn't, Whitman said. But they do. Then they're in danger. That's the working assessment. That's not a working assessment, Natalie said. That's a confirmed situation. If that intercept chain has been active for 10 days, and those names have been visible for 10 days, then the timeline for action on those contacts is not hypothetical. Whitman didn't argue with her, because she was right and they both knew it. Below them, the simulation team hit their first major obstacle. The western route fully blocked AI units repositioned to close the approach they'd used in the first run, and Ryan called a halt. Not the 90-second observation halt from the morning, a full stop. He turned to the team and said something that Natalie couldn't hear through the glass. Whatever he said, Torres responded to it immediately. And then the team changed direction entirely. Not back, not sideways, but toward the center of the simulation space. The one area neither scenario had prioritized, because it offered no obvious tactical advantage and represented the highest exposure. Natalie watched them go there. She watched Ryan lead them into the exposed center of a simulation designed to punish conventional approaches. Watched him hold them in the most vulnerable position on the floor. And watched what happened when the AI, which had been calibrated for peripheral engagement, encountered a team standing in the exact center of its operating environment. The system paused. Not long. 2-3 seconds. Barely visible from the observation room. But Natalie saw it. The micro-hesitation of a system whose behavioral prediction model had just encountered data that didn't match any of its established patterns. "He found a blind spot," she said. Whitman looked at the floor. The center position. The system model's peripheral behavior. Entry routes coverage approaches objective-oriented movement. It doesn't have strong predictive data for a team that voluntarily places itself in maximum exposure without an offensive objective. She paused. "He found the one place I didn't fully account for." "Is that good?" Whitman asked. Natalie looked at Ryan on the floor below. At the man who had laughed at her patch 2 days ago and was now standing in the center of a hostile simulation environment, having outthought a system she built with a team he had rebuilt from scratch in under 48 hours. "That's very good," she said. Then her radio buzzed. She unclipped it, read the message, and the expression on her face did something Ryan, watching from below, had never seen it do before. It went still in a different way. Not the stillness of someone observing or waiting or calculating. The stillness of someone absorbing impact. Ryan saw it from below, even though he couldn't read the message. He saw it because he had spent 2 days learning to read Natalie Brooks in the specific way you learn to read someone when you've stopped looking at what you expected to see and started looking at what's actually there. He gave Torres a hand signal. Hold. Torres held the team without question. Ryan looked up at the observation window. Natalie had already moved away from it. He found her in the hallway outside the simulation floor 3 minutes later, when he decided that whatever had just happened was more important than the scenario, and that Natalie Brooks, who had never in 2 days asked for anything, was standing alone in a hallway with a radio in her hand, and he was not going to walk past her. "What happened?" he said. She looked at him, and he saw something in her face that he hadn't seen before, that he suspected almost no one had seen, because what he saw required the kind of unguarded moment that she was very good at not producing. She was holding something that hurt. "One of the civilian contacts," she said. Her voice was level. The professionalism was intact, but it was the kind of intact that takes significant effort to maintain. "From Silent Horizon. He's been picked up for questioning by a third-party intelligence group. He's not military. He's not trained for interrogation resistance. He's a man who helped us because we needed help, and he believed it was the right thing to do." Ryan stood with that for a moment. "His name was in the intercept," he said. "His name was in the intercept," she confirmed. "How long has he been in custody?" "They're estimating 14 hours. Ryan did the math without wanting to. "Is there an extraction option?" "Shen is working the diplomatic channel," Natalie said. "That takes time. I'm not sure this man has." She stopped. And Ryan watched her do the thing he had been watching her do for 2 days, in every room and every situation. The thing where she took what she was carrying and organized it not into a place where it disappeared, but into a place where it could coexist with function. Where the weight didn't go away, but also didn't prevent movement. He had admired it before, He understood it now. His name is Darian Souza, she said. He was 43 years old when Silent Horizon happened. He had a produce market in the local district. He knew the area. He knew the routes. He fed us for 31 hours, and he told 3 different patrol elements that we weren't there, and every time he did it, he was risking his life and the lives of his family. She paused. He asked me when we extracted if the people who sent us would protect him. I told him they would. Ryan said nothing. I filed the protection request the week after we came back, she said. It was approved. The file was supposed to be sealed. Darian Souza was supposed to be invisible to every active intelligence operation on the planet. Her voice didn't waver, but her jaw tightened. He has 3 children. Ryan said, "What do you need?" Natalie looked at him. The same look she'd given him in the briefing room. The same look she'd given him when he apologized. The same fundamental direct assessment of whether what he was offering matched what the situation required. "I need to make a call," she said, "and I need someone who can help me build a case for accelerating the diplomatic process. Someone who understands the military documentation chain well enough to identify where the protection request was filed and whether the seal was properly executed." "I know the documentation chain," Ryan said. "I've filed and processed enough of them." Civilian protection under combat operations status is a specific subcategory, she said. "Not standard procedure." "I know it," he said. "My 3rd deployment. We had a similar situation. Different theater, same category. I spent 4 months in the documentation process." He held her gaze. "I know exactly which office handles the seal verification and who you need to talk to expedite the review." Natalie was quiet for 3 seconds. Long enough that Ryan counted them. Then she said, "Come with me." They spent the next 6 hours in a room that was not an office and not a briefing room, but the specific kind of military administrative space that exists between formal functions. A workspace with communications equipment, a clear desk, and enough clearance to handle documents that most people in the building couldn't touch. Ryan did something he had not expected to do when he woke up that morning. He worked, not tactically, not physically. He worked with documentation and communication chains and the specific grinding, careful process of tracing a protection request through a military administrative system that was designed, like all military administrative systems, to be thorough rather than fast. He pulled the original filing date. He identified the processing officer. He found the seal verification record and the point at which the document had been transferred from the original classification chain to a secondary archive. An archive that, when he looked at the transfer authorization, had a procedural irregularity in the witness signature. Not a forgery, not a deliberate breach, a procedural error. A missing co-authorization from the oversight officer. The kind of small bureaucratic failure that happens when documents move through a system too quickly and the people processing them are managing volume rather than detail. But a missing co-authorization meant the seal was technically incomplete, and a technically incomplete seal meant the document had not been fully protected under the classification standard it was supposed to carry. Ryan showed Natalie. She looked at the transfer authorization for a long moment. "This is why it surfaced," she said. "The seal had a gap," Ryan said. "Anyone with mid-level access to the secondary archive could have accessed the file without triggering the primary classification alert." "Can it be corrected retroactively?" "Yes," Ryan said. "But the correction doesn't fix the fact that it was accessible during the gap period. It only prevents future access." He paused. "What it does do is give Shen documentation that the compromise was a procedural failure rather than an intentional breach. That changes the diplomatic framing significantly. An accidental compromise in a civilian protection file is a different conversation than a deliberate intelligence exposure." Natalie was already reaching for the radio. She reached Shen in 40 seconds. She explained the finding in under 2 minutes, not because she was hurrying, but because she had already structured the relevant information before she made the call. Which was, Ryan was learning how she did everything. She answered Shen's questions, without hesitation, confirmed the documentation reference numbers Ryan had pulled, and ended the call with a conciseness that left no ambiguity about what she was asking for. "She's calling the diplomatic channel?" Natalie said, setting down the radio. "How long?" "Unknown." She looked at him. "But she has a stronger argument than she had this morning." Ryan sat back, looked at the documentation spread across the table, at the transfer authorization with its missing co-signature, at the file trail of a protection request that had been filed correctly, processed imperfectly, and exploited accidentally by a system that no one had designed to fail, but that had failed anyway, as systems do when the pressure of volume exceeds the capacity for care. "You said you told him they would protect him," Ryan said. "I did," she said. "Did you believe it when you said it?" Natalie considered the question. "I believed I would do everything I could to make it true," she said. "That's the only version of that promise I'm able to keep." Ryan nodded slowly. "That's the only version any of us can keep." She looked at him. Not with warmth exactly. Warmth wasn't the word for what Natalie Brooks expressed. But with the kind of recognition that passed between people when they had arrived from very different directions at the same understanding of something. His radio buzzed. "Torres." "Cole, something's happening up here." Whitman pulled everyone into the main briefing room. "Full base assembly. You need to come up." Ryan looked at Natalie. She had heard it. "Go," she said. "You're coming." "I'll be there in 2 minutes," she said. "I need to do one thing first." Ryan went. He walked fast, not running through corridors that felt different from how they'd felt 2 days ago, though he couldn't have said precisely what had changed. Not the physical space, the orientation of it, the way it felt to be moving through a place where he was no longer certain he was the most capable person in any given room, and had decided that uncertainty was more useful than the false certainty that had preceded it. The briefing room was full. Every soldier on the base who wasn't on active post had been assembled. Whitman was at the front, and his expression was the expression that Ryan had learned to read over years of service as the expression that precedes significant operational change. Shen was on the phone in the corner, talking, nodding, writing something. The room watched her the way rooms watch when someone is having a conversation whose result everyone is waiting for and nobody can influence. Natalie arrived exactly when she said she would. 2 minutes. No more. She came in and stood near the back, and Ryan moved to give her clear sightlines to the front, and for a moment they stood side by side, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the room wasn't already saying in the collective silence of 40-something people waiting for information. Shen ended the call. She turned. She looked at Natalie first, not at Whitman, not at the assembled base, at Natalie. "He's been released," Shen said. The room exhaled. Ryan heard it, the collective involuntary release of people who had been holding something in without realizing how much they were holding. Even the soldiers who didn't know specifically what had been happening, who had been assembled for reasons that hadn't been fully explained, felt the thing that moved through the room when Shen said those 3 words. "He's been released." Ryan looked at Natalie. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. The kind of 2 seconds that a person doesn't control, that happen below the level of decision, below the performance in the body, rather than the mind. Then she opened them, and she was Natalie Brooks again, composed and present, and already moving her attention toward the next thing. But Ryan had seen it. He had seen the 2 seconds. And he understood that what lived inside that 2-second gap was the thing that existed underneath all the stillness, underneath the precision, underneath the 20 years of survival. The real person, the one who had made a promise to a 43-year-old man with a produce market and 3 children, and had spent the last 6 hours of her professional life making sure that promise held. "Documentation is being processed for the full seal correction," Shen continued. "The oversight officer has been notified. We're treating it as procedural error with no indication of deliberate compromise." She looked around the room. "This situation is resolved. But the process that allowed it to exist is not resolved. And that process review begins formally tomorrow morning." Whitman nodded, looked at the assembled soldiers. "Dismissed. Debrief teams stay." The room began to clear. Torres appeared at Ryan's shoulder. "What just happened?" "A man who deserved to be protected is going home," Ryan said. Torres looked at Natalie. She was talking quietly with Whitman. Her posture was the same as it had been in every room settled economic without performance. But Torres looked at her the way you look at something when you've just learned it's heavier than it appears. "She's been carrying that the whole time we were running scenarios," Torres said. "Yes," Ryan said, "and she never said anything about it." "No." Torres was quiet for a moment. "How do you carry something like that and still do the work?" Ryan thought about the 2 seconds, about the closed eyes, about the version of Natalie Brooks that existed below the classified file and the combat master patch, and the simulation architecture, and the tactical precision. The version that made promises to civilians in desperate situations, and then spent years making sure those promises didn't become lies. "You don't carry it instead of the work," Ryan said. "You carry it with the work. They're the same weight." Torres didn't respond, but he didn't walk away either. They stood and watched Natalie finish her conversation with Whitman, watched her nod once at something he said, watched her turn and look at the room, at the soldiers still filtering out at Shen, gathering her materials at Torres, and Ryan standing near the back wall, with the expression she always had, which was not warm and not cold, but something that existed in the specific space between competence and care. The place where professionalism stops being a performance and becomes an identity. She walked toward them. "Second scenario is incomplete," she said to Ryan. He blinked. "I know what just happened," she said. "And it needed to happen and it's done. The scenario isn't." She looked at Torres. "I owe your team a complete evaluation. The debrief on the second run needs to happen before I can file the assessment." Torres looked at her for a moment. Then he said something Ryan hadn't heard from him before. Not the guarded performance-adjacent acknowledgement of the first 2 days. Something direct and unguarded and real. "Sergeant Brooks, I owe you an apology." Natalie looked at him. "The briefing room," Torres said. I laughed. I shouldn't have laughed. I looked at your patch and I made a decision about it before I had any right to make that decision. And I'm not saying this because of what I found out about Silent Horizon or the civilian protection situation or any of it. He held her gaze. I'm saying it because it was wrong before I knew any of those things. It was wrong the moment I did it, and I've been trying to figure out how to say that clearly since the debrief yesterday. Natalie looked at him for a long moment. Ryan watched her decide how to respond. Watched her sort through the options available to her dismissal acceptance deflection. The kind of gracious minimization that would have made Torres feel better immediately, but would have let him off the hook. Watched her land on something else entirely. I appreciate that, she said, and I'm going to ask you to do something with it. What? Torres said. Remember it the next time, she said. Not this specific situation. The next time you're in a room and your first instinct tells you what someone's worth before they've had a chance to demonstrate it. Remember what it cost your team to act on that instinct here. She paused. That's the only apology I need. Torres nodded. Once. Firmly. The nod of a man making a commitment rather than accepting a conclusion. Natalie looked at Ryan. Debrief in 20 minutes. She walked out. Ryan stood in the almost empty briefing room and thought about a man named Darian Souza who was going home to 3 children because a woman that this room had laughed at had spent 6 hours in an administrative workspace building the case that freed him. Thought about a patch that 2 words were stitched onto and all the weight those 2 words were carrying. Thought about 20 years of his own service and all the rooms he'd walked into and all the judgments he'd made before the making was warranted. Then he straightened, and he went to the debrief, because the work wasn't done, and Natalie Brooks had 41 hours left and he was not going to waste a single one of them. The debrief ran 2 hours and 17 minutes. Natalie drove it the way she drove everything without waste, without performance, without a single word that wasn't carrying its full weight. She walked Ryan's team through the second scenario decision by decision, not to grade them, but to show them the architecture of their own thinking. Where they had defaulted to pattern, where they had broken from it, where the communication had been clean, and where it had still carried the residue of the old habit, the instinct to filter, to present certainty rather than share uncertainty, to protect individual credibility at the cost of collective accuracy. The team listened differently than they had 2 days ago. It wasn't deference. It wasn't the performed attentiveness of soldiers sitting through a mandatory review. It was the specific quality of listening that happens when people have been inside an experience together and are now assembling the meaning of it, each person's account, adding something to the picture that no single account contained alone. Walsh was the first to identify the moment in the second run where he'd almost called a different direction and held it back. 42 minutes in, he said. I had a read on the northern position that I didn't voice. I was 60% confident it was right. I didn't say it because 60% felt like too much uncertainty to put into the communication channel when the team was already managing a lot. Natalie looked at him. What happened to that position 45 minutes in? Walsh paused. The AI reinforced it, moved 2 units in, which we then had to adjust around, Torres said. That cost us 4 minutes and a routing change. If Walsh had voiced his 60% read at 42 minutes, Natalie said, would the team have been able to evaluate it? Torres looked at Walsh. Walsh looked at the table. Yeah, Walsh said. Yeah, we could have evaluated it. 60% certainty voiced in time is worth more than 90% certainty voiced too late, Natalie said. That's not a tactical principle. That's a communication principle. And it applies everywhere this team will ever operate. Ryan watched the room absorb that. Watched Torres write something in his notepad. Watched the younger soldiers near the end of the table. Specialists, Chen and Barrera, who had spoken almost nothing in the first day's briefing and had spoken consistently and precisely throughout the second scenario, sit with the statement, the way you sit with something you've heard before, but are hearing correctly for the first time. When the debrief ended, nobody moved immediately. The room had the quality of a space where something had settled, not resolved into simplicity, but organized into a shape that people could carry. Natalie closed the folder in front of her. I'll file the full evaluation tomorrow morning. Ryan said, What does the evaluation say? She looked at him. That your team has a demonstrated capacity for rapid adaptation under pressure. That the communication deficit identified in the initial assessment showed measurable improvement within a 48-hour operational window. She paused. And that Fort Blackridge should consider structural changes to how it integrates assessments from unfamiliar sources during high-stakes briefings. The room was quiet. Torres said, That last part is about the first briefing. That last part is about every briefing that looks like the first briefing, Natalie said. This wasn't an isolated event. This is a systemic pattern in how military units process external expertise. I've observed it in 4 different installations. The specifics vary. The pattern doesn't. Chen spoke up for the first time at length. How do you change a systemic pattern without changing every individual in the system? Natalie looked at her. Chen was 24. She had the kind of direct, unself-conscious intelligence that either gets suppressed in institutional environments or becomes its most valuable asset, depending entirely on whether the institution is wise enough to recognize it. You don't change every individual, Natalie said. You change the incentive structure. Right now, the system rewards confidence and penalizes expressed uncertainty. You flip that. You create an environment where voicing a 60% read is professionally valued rather than professionally risky. She held Chen's gaze. The individuals change when the environment changes, not the other way around. Chen nodded slowly. Not the nod of someone who had been told something. The nod of someone who had been confirmed in something they were already thinking. The debrief closed. Soldiers filed out, and Ryan noticed the quality of their movement was different from how they'd moved out of the first briefing 2 days ago. Quieter, more internal. The specific gait of people carrying something they intended to keep, rather than people leaving a mandatory event they'd already begun to process as complete. Torres was the last of the team to go. He stopped at the door, looked at Natalie. He didn't say anything else. He had said what he needed to say in the briefing room after Darian Souza's release. What he gave her now was something simpler and in some ways harder. He looked at her with clear eyes and a straight posture, and no performance of any kind, which was the specific form of respect that exists between soldiers when one of them has shown the other something that fundamentally shifted their understanding of their own work. Then he was gone. Ryan and Natalie were alone. This had happened before over the past 48 hours in administrative rooms and hallways, and the observation level, and the workspace where they'd traced the protection file. Each time, the aloneness had contained something specific: urgency, or new information, or the particular weight of a developing crisis. This time, it contained something different: completion, or something close to it. "You're leaving tomorrow," Ryan said. "After I file the evaluation," she said. "Where do you go?" She looked at him, not as if the question were inappropriate, as if she were deciding what form of honesty best served the moment. "I go where the next assignment is. I don't know what it is yet. I won't know until I'm en route." Ryan nodded. He had understood that this was the architecture of her life, not a base she returned to, not a command structure that remained consistent, not the kind of career that accumulated in a single place. She moved. She arrived in rooms that didn't expect her. She did the work the rooms needed done, and then she left before she became part of the furniture. "Do you ever get tired of it?" he said. "Walking into rooms where you have to prove yourself before anyone will listen?" Natalie considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She didn't give him a quick answer because she didn't give any answer that wasn't considered. "Tired isn't the right word," she said finally. "I know what the room is going to do before it does it. I've been in enough versions of this room that the pattern is entirely predictable." She paused. "What tires me isn't the room. It's knowing that the people in it are capable of better, and spending the first part of every assignment watching them choose the easier thing." "And the second part," Ryan said. "The second part is watching them choose something harder," she said. "That's the part that makes the first part survivable." Ryan felt the weight of that land somewhere he recognized. Somewhere that 20 years of service had built without him having words for it, and that the last 48 hours had given him language for. The specific place in a person where the things they do that matter live separate from the things they do that are merely required. "The first day," he said. "The briefing room. When I said what I said." "Ryan." She said his first name for the first time, not warmly, not coldly. The way someone uses a first name when they want the next thing they say to arrive without the professional buffer. "I knew what that room was going to do before I walked into it. I'm not carrying what you said." "I'm not asking you to forgive it," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm saying it mattered. What I did in that room mattered, and not only because of how it affected you, because of what it said about who I was being." He paused. "I've been doing this work for 20 years. I thought I had learned the things that needed to be learned. I thought I knew what earned judgment looked like and what unearned judgment looked like, and I was wrong. Specifically, I was wrong in a room full of people who took their cue from me." He held her gaze. "That's not something I'm going to let be comfortable." "Say." Natalie was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. And the word was not harsh. It was the word of someone who had been hoping for exactly that answer and received it. They stood in the empty room for a moment more. Outside, the base was moving at its regular evening rhythm, post-rotations meal schedules, the ambient operational sounds of a military installation that continued independent of the individual dramas that unfolded inside it. In this room, it was quiet in the way that follows something that has been fully said. Natalie picked up her folder. "Get some sleep, Sergeant Cole. You've got a team that's going to need consistent leadership tomorrow and for a long time after I'm gone." "They're a good team," Ryan said. "They are now," she said. "They were always capable of being. They just needed a reason to stop performing and start functioning." She moved toward the door. "Natalie." She turned. "When Silent Horizon happened," he said, When you were in that position for 72 hours with 5 people and no extraction, and the team leader down, what did you hold on to? What kept you operating? It was a real question, not a professional question, the kind that a person asks when they have stopped performing the role and started speaking from inside it. Natalie looked at him for a long moment. The same thing you hold on to, she said. The people next to you. The belief that getting them home is worth every single thing it costs. She paused. And the understanding that the moment you start calculating whether it's worth it, you've already lost the most important part of yourself. She left. Ryan stood in the room alone and held that. He held it the way you hold something that is both true and heavy. The way you hold a thing when you know that setting it down would be the wrong response, even though it would be the easier one. Then he turned off the light and went to check on his team. Morning arrived at Fort Blackridge the way it always did, with the specific, non-negotiable insistence of a schedule that did not adjust itself to accommodate anything anyone was carrying internally. Post-rotation at 0400. Physical training at 0530. Administrative functions beginning at 0700. Natalie filed her evaluation at 0615. Ryan knew because Whitman told him. Whitman said it the way he said things that mattered, without signaling that they mattered, simply directly with the economy of a commanding officer who had learned that the best delivery for significant information was a plain voice and enough silence afterward for the information to be processed. She copied you on the findings, Whitman said. Ryan looked up. She copied me. The recommendation section. She cited your work on the protection file documentation as an example of adaptive professional function. Used it as supporting evidence for the team's capacity assessment. Whitman looked at him. That's not standard procedure. She added it, specifically. Ryan sat with that for a moment. Then he went to find her. She was in the hallway near the base's eastern exit, a bag over one shoulder, her tablet in her left hand. The same economy of movement she'd had every moment he'd observed her, and the same absence of performance that had initially read to him as a deficiency, and now read as the clearest possible signal of someone who did not need external confirmation to know exactly what they were. You copied me on the evaluation, he said. I documented what happened, she said. You were part of what happened. The protection file work was operational, not. It demonstrated exactly what the evaluation was designed to assess, she said. Adaptive function under unfamiliar conditions. Application of existing expertise in a non-standard context. Communication under pressure. She looked at him steadily. You worked 6 hours on a problem you'd never encountered in a documentation chain you'd only partially navigated before, and you found the gap that changed the diplomatic calculation. That goes in the evaluation. Ryan felt something he didn't immediately have a word for. Not gratitude exactly. Not pride. Something that sat between them, the feeling of being seen accurately by someone who had no motivation to see you charitably. The specific weight of fair witness. Thank you, he said. She nodded. Take care of your team. I will. She started moving toward the exit. He walked with her. Not because she'd asked, because the hallway led the same direction, and it felt wrong to stop walking before she reached the door. Torres was in the hallway too. Ryan didn't know if it was deliberate or accidental. Probably deliberate in the way that things Torres did were generally deliberate, even when he framed them otherwise. He was standing near the wall with a coffee cup looking at nothing in particular, and when Natalie passed, he straightened without making it a ceremony. Safe travels, Sergeant Brooks, he said. Stay honest, Sergeant Torres, she said. She kept walking. Walsh appeared from a side corridor, definitely deliberate, definitely coordinated, definitely the kind of thing a team does when it has become something more than a collection of individual operators. He was with Chen and Barrera, and they stood in a loose grouping that wasn't a formal send-off and wasn't trying to be. Just presence. The physical acknowledgement of people who had been changed by an encounter and wanted the person responsible to know it before she walked out of their building. Natalie stopped. She looked at them. At Walsh and Chen and Barrera, at Torres down the hall, at Ryan beside her. She didn't make a speech. She wasn't built for speeches. but she looked at each of them in turn with the direct, unfiltered focus she brought to everything, and Ryan understood that what she was doing was seeing them. Actually seeing them the way she had seen his team's patterns in the simulation, and Darian Souza's worth in a hostile environment, and the procedural gap in a protection file that everyone else had missed. She was seeing them, and letting them see that she was seeing them, which was the specific form of recognition that Natalie Brooks was capable of offering. It was not a small thing. Chen said, "We're going to do the work differently." Natalie looked at her. "I know," she said. And she said it with the certainty of someone who could read patterns well enough to project their trajectory, not with the hopeful optimism of someone who wanted it to be true. She turned and walked through the door. Gone. The hallway held the particular quality it holds when a significant presence has just left it not empty but different, reorganized around the absence. Walsh looked at Ryan. "Do you know where she's going?" "No," Ryan said. "Do you think she'll come back?" Ryan thought about the nature of Natalie Brooks's assignments, about the restricted classification, and the temporary postings, and the life that moved through rooms, rather than settling in them. About the 48 hours she'd spent at Fort Blackridge, changing something fundamental in the way 40-some soldiers understood their own assumptions. "She'll go where someone needs what she has," he said. "And they probably won't know they need it until she walks in." Torres made a quiet sound. "And then someone will look at her patch and say something stupid." "Probably," Ryan said. "And she'll sit in the back corner with her tablet and wait for them to be wrong." "Yes." Torres shook his head slowly. Not in frustration. In something that was closer to wonder at the specific courage it required to operate the way Natalie operated, to walk into room after room, knowing exactly how it was going to begin, and trusting yourself enough to know how it was going to end. "What do we do now?" Barrera said. It was a genuine question. The question of a soldier who had just come through something that reorganized their understanding of the work and was standing on the other side of it, trying to identify the first step forward. Ryan looked at the door Natalie had walked through. Then he looked at his team. "We go back to work," he said. "But we go back differently." They went back. The weeks that followed at Fort Blackridge were not dramatic in the way that briefing rooms and simulation floors and classified files are dramatic. They were dramatic in the quieter, more durable way that happens when real change takes root in the daily habits of people who have decided to do something harder than they were doing before. Ryan noticed it in the briefing room 3 days later when a support analyst named Vasquez, 22 years old, attached to the program in a logistics coordination role, the kind of person who sat near the back and generally wasn't expected to contribute to tactical discussion, raised her hand during a strategy review and said she'd identified a timing vulnerability in the proposed approach. The room didn't laugh. Nobody questioned whether she had the standing to make the observation. Sergeant Torres, who was running the review, said, "Walk us through it." And Vasquez walked them through it, and she was right, and the approach was adjusted. Ryan sat at the front of that room and felt something that was not quite pride, and not quite satisfaction, but the specific low-frequency emotion of someone watching a cause produce its intended effect. He wrote it up in his weekly report, not in the language of institutional change or cultural improvement, in the plain language of operational outcomes. Vasquez's observation had identified a vulnerability that would have cost the team 8 minutes and a secondary positioning error in the field. The adjustment was made in under 3 minutes of briefing time. Net operational improvement significant. He sent the report to Whitman. Whitman forwarded it. Ryan learned 2 days later to Colonel Shen. And Shen apparently sent a copy to the unnamed installation where Natalie Brooks had arrived to begin her next assignment. Ryan didn't know this from official channels. He knew it because Whitman told him in the same plain, economical way Whitman delivered everything. "She knows," Whitman said. Ryan nodded. He thought about that. About the idea of Natalie Brooks in another room, in another installation, sitting in another back corner with her tablet, while another version of a room that didn't know what it was looking at performed its predictable first act. And receiving somewhere in the middle of that, a forwarded report from a base she'd spent 48 hours in, telling her that the thing she'd started there was still running. He thought about what she'd said in the hallway outside the simulation floor the first evening about what tired her and what made it survivable. He thought about Walsh's 60% read now voiced routinely, about Chen asking questions that used to stay unasked, about Torres running briefings where the back of the room had equal standing to the front, about Vasquez, the process review Shen had ordered after the Souza situation ran for 3 weeks. It identified the protection file irregularity as symptomatic of a broader documentation processing gap that affected 6 other active protection cases across 3 installations. All 6 were corrected. 2 of the cases were upgraded to higher seal classifications. 1 led to a complete reprocessing of the original operational file. Darian Souza received formal written confirmation that his protection status had been retroactively corrected and fully sealed. Ryan read about this in a brief summary from Whitman. He didn't know if Natalie received the same summary. He hoped she did. He thought sometimes about her telling the team in the debrief about Souza not the details of the mission, but the man himself. The produce market. The 3 children. The patrols he'd misdirected. The question he'd asked at extraction that she had answered, and then spent 3 years making sure remained true. He thought about the version of strength that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't need the room to know what it survived. That walks in, does the work, and walks out and leaves the room fundamentally different from how it found it without requiring credit for the change. He had spent 20 years believing he understood what that looked like. He understood now that he had been describing the surface of it. The real version was quieter, more durable, less interested in being seen and more committed to seeing. Less concerned with the room's initial judgment and more focused on what the room would be capable of after it corrected that judgment. 2 months after Natalie Brooks walked out of Fort Blackridge's eastern exit, Ryan Cole received a request. It came through official channels routed through Whitman, authorized by Shen. A newly commissioned lieutenant at a training installation 2 states away had been assigned to an integrated assessment program. She was 24 years old. She came from a support background. She had a record that her supervising commander described as exceptional, but she was struggling to establish credibility with the operational teams she was working with. The request asked whether Ryan could contribute to a 2-day assessment framework for the installation. Consultation basis. He would observe team briefings and provide feedback on communication pattern assessment. The request didn't say who had suggested his name. It didn't need to. Ryan accepted within the hour. He packed a bag that evening, the specific considered way you pack when you know you're going somewhere that matters. He thought about what he was bringing to that room. Not his rank, not his 20 years, though those would be present, not the authority he'd been used to carrying as the senior operator in any given space. He was bringing the thing Natalie had built in him over 48 hours of precise, patient, unsentimental instruction. The understanding that a room's first judgment is not its final capacity, that the most valuable information in any briefing is most likely to come from the person nobody is looking at yet, that 60% voiced in time beats 90% delivered too late, that competence doesn't announce itself, and the inability to recognize quiet competence is not just a personal failure, it is an operational vulnerability that costs missions and costs lives. He was going to a room where a 24-year-old woman was being dismissed before she'd been given a chance to demonstrate what she carried. He knew exactly what that room looked like. He had been the person running it. He drove out of Fort Blackridge at first light. The gate guard gave him the standard clearance acknowledgement. Nothing marked the departure as significant. Nothing announced that the man passing through that gate was carrying something different from what he'd carried when he arrived at this installation 8 months ago, before a woman with a tablet and a combat master patch sat in the back corner of his briefing room and quietly began the work of changing everything he thought he understood about what it meant to see clearly. He didn't need it to be announced. That was the lesson. That was always the lesson. The strongest things don't declare themselves. They simply do what they came to do precisely and without ceremony, and they leave the world measurably different from how they found it, not because anyone was watching, but because the work was worth doing, whether anyone was watching or not. Ryan Cole drove toward a room that didn't know what it needed yet, and he carried in the quiet and deliberate way that Natalie Brooks had taught him by example exactly what that room required.